During Trajan's 103-day victory games, over 9,000 animals and thousands of people died. Some were forced to play Orpheus, only to be torn apart mid-song by beasts. Rome's glory wasn't paid in gold, but in bodies and silence. Who truly bore the cost of these triumphs? Chronicles record victories. Archaeology bones and bitter poetry tell the missing story. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. At sunrise, the Colosseum stirred to life. Its towering arches caught the first streaks of pale light shadows stretching across stone still stained from yesterday's blood. Beneath the seats, vendors shouted for attention, their baskets crammed with figs, olives, and watered wine. Smoke rose from braziers where cheap cuts of meat hissed, mixing with the sharp tang of iron and damp limestone. Rome was awake, and it was hungry. Beyond the gates, handlers shoved half-starved predators into their cages. Lions with ribs, showing through their fur, snapped at the air. Elephants swung their tusks in rage chains, rattling as they stamped the ground. Panthers clawed the bars until sparks flew. The animals smelled the crowd before they saw it. They smelled fear, sweat, and blood. From the dark tunnels, the clang of swords rang out. Fighters tested their edges on stone, listening to the steel sing. Armor was strapped, shields checked, helmets tightened. The sand waited above a silent stage, about to be drenched again. Every sound carried upward. Chains dragged, whips cracked, gates groaned, and the low murmur of thousands gathering became a single rising roar. 50,000 Romans filled the seats shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the arena's gates. They came not for play, not for competition, but for what Rome had perfected better than any other empire, death dressed as entertainment. The Colosseum trembled with anticipation. The air itself seemed to tighten, and as the roar of the crowd swelled, the gates began to creak open. The story of Rome's gladiators does not begin with the grandeur of the Colosseum or emperors in gilded robes. It begins with a funeral intimate, grim, and soaked in blood. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus, Junius, Brutus, Scaeva sought to honor their father. Not with statues, not with solemn prayers, but with death. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and forced them to fight in the Forum Boarium, Rome's bustling cattle market. The place reeked of dung smoke and livestock. Amidst the cries of animals and the stink of tradesmen were made to kill for remembrance. This was not spectacle yet. It was duty. The Romans called it a munus, an obligation to the dead. The word itself suggests burden payment, the settling of a debt. The dead could not be left unaided. They demanded offerings. For centuries across Italy, warriors had been killed beside graves as gifts to appease restless spirits. Sacrifice was insurance, a guarantee that the dead would not return angry. But the Romans, ever practical, shifted this tradition. Rather than slaughtering random victims, they compelled duels. The dead no longer received anonymous lives. They received a display of combat, a performance of violence. The roots ran deeper than Rome. In Campania, Samnite warriors had staged funeral combats for generations. Among the Etruscans, tomb paintings depict armed men fighting before the dead. Archaeology confirms that these were not symbolic images. In Tarquinia, bone fragments show wounds consistent with staged combat. Roman elites, always eager to borrow and adapt, embraced this foreign ritual and made it their own. The effect was immediate. To bury a man with treasures displayed wealth. To bury him with bloodshed displayed power. A man's heirs could proclaim their loyalty not only to family, but to the gods, to tradition, and to Rome itself. In the crowded forum, the deaths of slaves were statements of legitimacy. Violence became an heirloom passed from father to son, along with land and name. As the decades passed, funerals shifted. Blood was no longer an offering to the shades of the departed alone. It was an offering to the living. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's magistrates and generals recognized the political power hidden in the ritual. Funerary games could do more than honor the dead. They could stabilize society. They could purchase loyalty. Religious festivals began to feature gladiatorial fights. Once meant for solemn sacrifice offerings to Jupiter, now became theaters of blood. Senators framed the games as piety, insisting that every cut was prayer. But the crowd knew differently. The fights were spectacles, state-sponsored violence, meant to bind citizens through shared awe. Even armor became part of the message. Early gladiators were dressed not as Romans, but as enemies Rome had conquered. The Samnite fighter carried the heavy shield and short sword of his people. The Thracian wielded a curved blade light and treacherous. The Gaul bore a broad sword and helmet designed to mimic the tribes once feared. Every duel replayed Rome's victories. The crowd watched enemies defeated again and again. Death became propaganda. Every drop of blood reminded the city Rome always prevailed. Archaeology deepens this picture. Reliefs carved into tombs in Capua and Lucera show gladiators paired in ritual combat, their weapons stylized, but their wounds real. Inscriptions record how many pairs fought at a nobleman's funeral, numbers climbing from a few to dozens. What began as an intimate offering became an arms race of cruelty. To honor an ancestor with mere statues seemed hollow. To provide him with a theater of slaughter gave the family prestige that echoed across the city. The funerals themselves changed character. Where once a pyre burned or a procession carried garlands, now temporary wooden arenas were erected. Platforms allowed thousands to watch. The transition from ritual to entertainment had begun. By the late Republic, gladiatorial funerals drew not hundreds, but tens of thousands. The death of one man became the suffering of many, and grief became spectacle. Comparisons stretch across the Mediterranean. In Homer's Iliad, Patroclus is honored with funeral games, chariot races, boxing, spear throwing. But those contests, though brutal, did not end in deliberate death. In Etruria, blood was shed before tombs, but not institutionalized into an industry. Only Rome systematized the violence, transforming ritual into institution, grief into propaganda. What began as obligation became obsession. Politicians discovered that funerary games steadied crowds, softened anger, and reminded citizens of Rome's dominance. The stage of grief turned into a stage of power. Each heir who arranged gladiatorial contests made declarations at once loyalty to his ancestors and loyalty to the Republic. In this duality, the seeds of the arena were planted. By the 2nd century BC, gladiatorial combat was no longer private mourning. It belonged to the state. Funeral duels became public festivals. The message was clear. Rome commanded men armies, and even death itself. Looking back, no one at the Forum Boarium in 264 BC could have foreseen what their ritual would become. What began as sacrifice at a cattle market would grow into an empire's obsession. The munus, a duty to the dead, had evolved into a weapon. Not merely power over life, but power over the meaning of death. The funerals had planted the seed. What began as obligation to the dead now became a tool for the living. By the late 3rd century BC, gladiatorial contests were no longer just family duties. They had been seized by the Republic itself. What had once belonged to private grief now belonged to the state. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible at first. A senator sponsoring funeral games gained not only piety, but popularity. Crowds flocked to watch, and the sponsor's name spread on the lips of thousands. Soon, magistrates recognized the potential. If blood could command loyalty at a funeral, it could command loyalty for the Republic. Violence became a currency of politics. Armor told the story as much as the blood itself. Each fighter was dressed to symbolize Rome's enemies. The Samnite with his oblong shield and plumed helmet. The Thracian with his curved seeker blade, quick and treacherous. The Gaul with his heavy broadsword and towering stature. When the crowd watched them bleed, they did not see anonymous men. They saw Rome's conquests replayed again and again. Each duel was a living reminder of victories past. The Senate cloaked this shift in language of religion. They declared the game's offerings to Jupiter Mars and the spirits of ancestors. Each strike of the sword was framed as a form of worship. But beneath the veil of piety lay something else: propaganda. By turning ritual into spectacle, the Republic taught its citizens that Rome was unconquerable. Enemies had been defeated before. They would be defeated again. The sand itself became a theater of empire. Archaeology confirms how quickly the contests expanded. Temporary wooden stands erected in the forum could no longer contain the crowds. By the 2nd century BC, amphitheaters began to rise. At first, they were crude circles of timber seats, packed tight sand drenched in blood. But soon, stone replaced wood. Violence demanded permanence. Temples to cruelty were carved into the heart of cities, monuments where thousands could gather to watch life extinguished for glory. The growth of the games mirrored Rome's growth. As the Republic expanded across the Mediterranean, the spectacles grew larger, bloodier, more frequent. The logic was clear conquest, abroad control at home. Each gladiatorial fight was proof of Rome's mastery, not just of foreign lands, but of death itself. Writers of the time began to notice. Cicero called the games a display of discipline and courage, yet also admitted their political weight. The crowd did not cheer only for skill. They cheered for Rome's reflection in the sand. Livy recorded the growth of gladiatorial shows, noting how what began as 3 pairs of fighters at a funeral swelled to dozens, even hundreds. The Republic had discovered its most reliable spectacle. There were parallels in other cultures, but none so organized. The Greeks had Olympic contests, tests of strength and speed, but they did not demand blood. The Carthaginians had sacrifices, but they did not turn them into mass entertainment. Rome alone fused death with performance-transforming ritual into a tool of governance. The irony was clear. The munus, once a burden to honor the dead, had become a weapon to command the living. What had been duty became display. What had been grief became propaganda. By the 1st century BC, the games were no longer tied to funerals at all. They stood on their own public celebrations, sponsored by politicians, eager for votes, and generals eager for prestige. Families still claimed traditions, but everyone knew the truth. The sand was now an instrument of statecraft. Each fight carried the same whispered message: Rome controlled men armies and even death. To sit in the stands was to be reminded of empire. To cheer was to pledge loyalty. The roar of the crowd was not innocent. It was the sound of consent shouted loud enough to echo through history. The duty had been fulfilled. Rome no longer honored the dead. It commanded the living. By the 1st century, BC blood in the arena was not confined to men. Nature itself was dragged onto the sand and made to die for Rome's pleasure. These were the Venatianes' hunts staged inside the amphitheatre. What had once been the realm of forests, deserts, and rivers was now compressed into a killing ground framed by stone. Exotic animals arrived from the farthest edges of the known world. Lions from North Africa, their ribs jutting from starvation. Leopards from the Caucasus snarling in iron cages. Crocodiles chained from the Nile, dragged hundreds of miles overland. Even giraffes, creatures so strange, the Romans called them camelopards, half camel, half leopard, were marched into the city. They were not displayed as wonders of nature. They were condemned as prey. Julius Caesar set the tone in 46 BC. To celebrate his triumphs, he paraded Rome's first giraffe through the city. The crowd marveled at its long neck, its gentle gaze. But admiration quickly turned to horror. The animal was herded into the arena and slaughtered. The message was clear. If Rome could capture the strangest beasts alive, it could conquer anything. Wonder was not the goal. Domination was. When the Colosseum opened in AD 80, Emperor Titus raised the stakes to madness. Over 9,000 animals were killed in a single festival. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale. Bones of lions and bears, unearthed from beneath the arena floor, carry grooves and cut marks, proof of deliberate starvation. They had been weakened before release, to ensure they died quickly to keep the blood flowing on schedule. Even elephants, once the terror of Roman legions under Hannibal, were led into the arena to be butchered. Creatures that had once symbolized fearsome enemies were reduced to stage props. The crowd cheered as the beasts fell, their deaths replaying Rome's victory not only over Hannibal, but over nature itself. The logistics behind these hunts were staggering. Caravans stretched across deserts, dragging cages through scorching sands. Fleets floated chained animals down the Nile. Handlers risked their lives to keep predators alive just long enough to die in the Colosseum. Archaeology in North Africa reveals holding pens where lions were stockpiled, waiting for transport. Wooden slats grooved by claws, bones of gazelles used as feed, all testify to the machinery of capture. The hunts were never fair. Animals were maimed before release tendons cut, to hobble them, or chained to restrict movement. Sometimes dozens were unleashed at once, driven to frenzy by hunger and thirst. Bears forced to fight bulls. Lions pitted against leopards. Panthers goaded into clawing at helpless men dressed as hunters. It was slaughter disguised as combat nature, turned into a carnival of cruelty. Ancient writers recorded the toll. Pliny the Elder warned of species vanishing from their homelands after decades of Roman slaughter. Lions grew scarce in North Africa. Elephants dwindled in number. The Colosseum was not just a theatre of death. It was an ecological wrecking ball. Extinction was the price of entertainment. But for Rome, extinction did not matter. What mattered was the illusion that nature itself could be caged, starved, and destroyed for applause. Behind the noise of the crowd, quieter tragedies unfolded. Bones excavated from amphitheaters across the empire bear signs of deliberate mutilation. Ribs cracked not by predators, but by handlers' clubs. Skulls pierced with iron spikes used to subdue them. Even in death, the animals were managed like inventory, reduced to carcasses on the empire's ledger. The crowd roared, children laughed, vendors sold wine and bread. But every carcass on the sand was another brick in Rome's wall of control. Every dead beast was proof that the empire's reach extended not only over men, but over the very wildness of the earth. The Venationes blurred the line between conquest and spectacle. To watch a giraffe torn apart was to see Africa subdued. To watch an elephant collapse was to replay Hannibal's defeat. Rome staged its victories, not only over peoples, but over landscapes, animals, and the natural order itself. In the Colosseum, nothing was safe. Not man, not beast, not even nature itself. The Venationes, the staged hunts of animals inside the Colosseum, were already spectacles of domination. To the crowd, they were thrilling diversions between gladiator duels and executions. To the emperors, they were something more. They became performances of power, carefully orchestrated dramas in which the ruler himself stepped into the sand and claimed the role of both hunter and god. The idea was not new. Julius Caesar had once filled Rome with marvels, parading exotic beasts through the forum as trophies of conquest. Augustus staged games that brought elephants and crocodiles into the arena, their deaths meant to remind citizens of his reach. But by the 2nd century AD, the tradition shifted. It was no longer enough for an emperor to sponsor bloodshed. Some demanded to take part in it themselves. No emperor embodied this more than Commodus. Draped in the lion skin of Hercules, carrying a club or bow, he marched into the arena not as a man, but as a demigod. He slaughtered bears from raised platforms, speared panthers tethered by chains, and shot arrows into ostriches until their long necks snapped. The animals were weakened beforehand, starved, drugged, or maimed, so that his heroics posed no risk. The outcome was always certain, yet the performance was required and the applause compulsory. Writers of the time describe how Commodus basked in the cheers. He forced senators to stand, forced nobles to clap, forced the people to pretend they believed in his strength. To withhold approval was dangerous. In Rome, silence in the Colosseum could be interpreted as treason outside it. And so tens of thousands roared, as if they admired him, even while they whispered the truth in private, a fragile man hidden in costume, acting out the myth of Hercules. Archaeology supports these accounts. Layers of animal bones beneath the Colosseum floor are concentrated in strata from his reign. Many show signs of deliberate starvation, gnawed bones, emaciated frames, animals too weak to fight. Some skeletons bear cut marks on tendons, evidence that beasts were hobbled before release. They were not presented as predators, but as sacrifices to the emperor's ego. Beyond Rome, the empire became a machine to feed his spectacles. Inscriptions in North Africa record shipments of lions and leopards to the capital. Governors boasted of their contributions carved in stone, hoping to win favor by sending animals for slaughter. Hunters risked their lives in deserts and mountains, dragging beasts from their habitats into cages. Entire landscapes were scoured bare. Villages were stripped of predators, species dwindled. Pliny the Elder had already warned decades earlier that the supply could not last. But under Commodus, the appetite only grew. The scale was staggering. A single festival under Titus, inaugurating the Colosseum in AD 80, had killed over 9,000 animals in days. Under Trajan, the celebrations after his victory over the Dacians lasted 123 days, with tens of thousands of men and beasts slain. But Commodus turned these numbers into personal theatre. Every carcass was framed not as Rome's triumph, but as his own. He renamed months after his titles minted coins, showing himself as Hercules, and demanded that temples honor him not as emperor, but as a living god. The hunts reveal the psychology of power at its most fragile. Emperors feared irrelevance as much as rebellion. Sponsoring bloodshed was not enough. They had to enact it to prove, before the eyes of the people, that even nature bent before them. If lions could be tamed, if elephants could be felled, if ostriches could collapse beneath an emperor's arrow, then what enemy could Rome fear? But the truth was plain. The crowd did not roar from belief. They roared from fear. The hunts became compulsory rituals of loyalty where applause was survival. Commodus demanded it. Domitian followed with midnight torchlit hunts, keeping the city unsettled, unsure when sport might turn to terror. Even emperors remembered as capable like Trajan could not resist. Victory celebrations were written not only in monuments, but in rivers of blood spilled on the sand. The price of this theatre was ruinous. Caravans trekked across deserts with cages. Ships carried beasts down the Nile. Hunters died in ambushes, their quarry as dangerous as any soldier. Treasury accounts drained into the logistics of cruelty. Commodus, in particular, bled the state dry, diverting vast sums into his spectacles. He was not simply performing power. He was bankrupting the empire to sustain his fantasies. The ecological cost was permanent. By the 3rd century, lions had vanished from parts of North Africa where they once roamed freely. Elephants, once common, dwindled sharply. Some species pushed toward extinction existed in Rome only as fading memories. The Colosseum was not just a theatre of death. It was an ecological wrecking ball, reshaping landscapes far beyond the empire's borders. And yet the shows continued, because they were not just entertainment. They were lessons. Each slaughter told the people the same story. The emperor commanded beasts, commanded men, commanded death itself. Power was not hidden in marble halls. It was written in blood before the eyes of 50,000 citizens. For Commodus, the Colosseum was not merely a stage. It was a mirror. In it he saw himself as Hercules divine untouchable. But the mirror was fragile. Behind the lion skin stood a man desperate for validation, so insecure that he needed corpses to prove he was more than human. The crowd knew. The Senate knew. History knew. The emperors of Rome hunted not because they loved danger, but because they feared obscurity. They killed to be adored, demanded cheers to silence their doubt, and turned beasts into props for their paranoia. The Colosseum trembled with their cruelty. The empire itself bent to supply it. And for a time, applause drowned out the ruin beneath. The popular imagination still clings to a myth, two gladiators of equal strength locked in a duel of honor beneath the sun. Steel against steel, courage against courage. The outcome uncertain until the last heartbeat. But the Colosseum was not built on honor. It was built on manipulation. Rome engineered cruelty. The reality was far darker. Most matches were not balanced contests, but careful calibrations of tension. The goal was not fairness. The goal was spectacle, surprise, humiliation, cruelty stretched for maximum applause. The condemned filled the ranks. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, men and women sentenced not to prison but to performance. Many were given wooden swords or dulled blades. Some wore costumes meant to draw ridicule, cloaks of rags, helmets so heavy they could barely raise their heads. They were sent against trained fighters who had drilled for years in gladiator schools. The outcome was never in doubt. The audience came not to see who would win, but how long the doomed could stumble before collapse. The arsenal of Rome's imagination was wide. The retiarius carrying a net and trident was paired against the secutor, his helmet rounded to deflect the net's weighted cords. The fight was engineered suspense, a riddle in motion. Would the fisherman ensnare his prey? Or would the hunter close in sword flashing through mesh helmet, gleaming with sweat? The pairing was not about skill alone. It was about story. Other designs leaned into humiliation. Some gladiators fought blind helmets, slitted so narrow they could not see the strike until it landed. Others had one arm bound, forced to defend themselves with half a body. Some matches were uneven by number one man against three, or an entire squad against a single veteran. The crowd cheered imbalance because imbalance was Rome's philosophy. Domination was the point. Archaeology reinforces the brutality. Excavations at gladiator schools in Pompeii and Ephesus uncovered training helmets weighing over 15 pounds more than twice the weight of military gear. They were not made for combat, but for exhaustion, forcing trainees to collapse under the strain, breaking them into instruments of spectacle. Skeletons from gladiator cemeteries tell the same story. Bones show repeated fractures, legs healed, broken, and healed again. One shoulder massively overdeveloped from years of wielding a sword, the other left thin and wasted. These were not balanced athletes. They were bodies shaped into grotesque asymmetry by years of brutal training. The rules of combat were written less for fairness than for drama. Officials in the arena, the summa rudis, held long staffs to signal when a fight should continue, pause, or end. Their job was not justice, but pacing. A contest cut short denied the crowd its thrill. A contest stretched too long risked boredom. The referee's staff was not a shield of fairness, but a conductor's baton orchestrating cruelty into rhythm. And then there were the gladiatresses, women forced into combat. Ancient writers like Juvenal sneered at them, mocking the absurdity of women in armor. But inscriptions and skeletal evidence confirm their existence. They fought each other. They fought dwarfs. They fought animals. Their presence was spectacle layered with shock value meant to blur gender roles for the amusement of the crowd. Their blood reinforced Rome's hunger for novelty. No one, not man, woman, or child, was beyond the reach of the Colosseum's cruelty. The design of these contests mirrored Rome's worldview. Empire was built not on equality, but on hierarchy. A prisoner forced to fight with a wooden sword against a trained gladiator was Rome against the provinces, the conqueror against the conquered. His death was a lesson visible to 50,000 eyes. Resistance was hopeless, defiance ridiculous. Even the armor itself became punishment. Some helmets muffled sound so completely that fighters stumbled deaf in the roar of the crowd. Others narrowed vision so tightly that men fought half-blind. What should have protected instead degraded, turning survival into mockery. For the audience, these engineered cruelties fed suspense. They leaned forward as the mismatched pair circled, as the doomed man faltered, as hope flickered and died. Applause rose, not for skill, but for the drama of despair. It was the same logic that drove executions, the same hunger for spectacle disguised as sport. Behind the roar, quieter tragedies unfolded. Inscriptions carved on gravestones of gladiators show their age at death 22, 25, sometimes 30 at the oldest. Few lived long enough to escape. The crowd celebrated their bravery. The state celebrated its control. The men themselves left only fragments of epitaphs' names, shortened to nicknames years marked by blood. Rome called it entertainment. Philosophers like Seneca called it hardening of the soul. But to the fighters, it was life reduced to theatre. Their sweat, their broken bones, their deaths were rehearsed scripts in the empire's endless performance of domination. The Colosseum thrived on imbalance. It perfected the art of cruelty by ensuring no fight was ever fair. Each mismatch was propaganda, each humiliation a lesson, each engineered suspense a reminder of Rome's absolute power. The image of two men meeting as equals beneath the sun belongs to legend. The truth is written in bones and helmets, in scars and pits of sand. Gladiatorial combat was not about courage, it was about control. And cruelty was its sharpest weapon. The Colosseum was never only about combat, it was about story. Every match was scripted to tell a narrative, and those narratives were designed not for truth, but for propaganda. Rome used the arena to retell its victories, to humiliate its enemies, and to erase identities by dressing the conquered as caricatures. Gladiators were often costumed to represent the foes Rome had already defeated. The Samnite fighter carried a heavy shield and broadsword echoing the Samnite people, once crushed by Roman legions. The Thracians, armed with a curved blade, mocked the Thracians of the Balkans. The Gaul, broad and fierce, replayed Rome's victories over the tribes of Gaul. Each bout was more than blood sport. It was a reenactment of conquest, a ritual humiliation of entire peoples before a roaring crowd. The message was relentless. Rome had conquered, Rome had triumphed, and Rome would continue to triumph. Even in sport, its enemies were reduced to entertainment. The arena became an echo chamber of empire, where every scream, every cut, every death reminded spectators of Rome's supremacy. But the mockery went further. Dwarfs were forced into combat, their bodies turned into objects of ridicule. Women, too, were made to fight, their presence sold as scandalous novelty. The gladiatresses clashed with each other or against dwarfs, their bloodshed framed, not as heroism, but as titillation. Juvenal sneered that Roman women preferred the sand to the loom, mocking them for daring to step into the arena. Yet their very existence proved the appetite for spectacle had no boundaries. Gender itself was fair game for Rome's cruelty. The costumes and weapons turned identity into punishment. Some fighters were forced into helmets so oversized that they staggered beneath the weight, becoming comic figures before their inevitable deaths. Others were dressed as mythic monsters or grotesque parodies of foreign tribes. Their defeat was scripted from the moment the gates opened. It was less about combat than about cultural erasure. Archaeology uncovers the traces of these performances. Reliefs carved into stone show gladiators labeled with ethnic names Samnite, Thraex, Gaul. Helmets excavated from sites like Pompeii bear distinctive designs, crests, visors, and ornaments crafted not for protection, but for recognition, so that the crowd knew exactly which enemy was being humiliated. The armor was theater as much as defense. The mockery extended even to the dead. Inscriptions found in burial grounds outside Rome sometimes reduce men to their fighting role rather than their names. A man remembered not as Marcus or Lucius, but as Gaul. His identity consumed by the costume Rome had forced upon him. For women in the arena, the humiliation cut deeper. Their very presence defied traditional Roman values of modesty and domesticity. But in the Colosseum, this defiance was scripted, staged, and punished. They were exoticized, sexualized, and destroyed for spectacle. Bones of female gladiators, rare but real, show the same trauma as men fractures, sword cuts, evidence of brutal combat. Their novelty lay not in skill, but in transgression. Rome's message was clear. No boundary, not even gender, stood outside its power to exploit. The crowd reveled in these spectacles of distortion. They laughed as dwarfs swung oversized swords, as women struggled in armor too large for their frames, as barbarians reenacted their own defeat. Every costume was a lesson, every humiliation a reminder of empire. This theater of mockery was not confined to the Colosseum. Across the empire, smaller arenas staged the same dramas. Inscriptions from provincial towns, record games where local captives were dressed in enemy costumes and killed before their neighbors. The empire's propaganda machine reached into every corner, reinforcing domination not only through armies, but through spectacle. And yet the cruelty had a deeper logic. By staging enemies again and again in mock battles, Rome denied them dignity, even in memory. A Gaul could not be remembered as brave only as a defeated gladiator. A Thracian could not be recalled as a warrior only as a comic figure in the sand. The arena rewrote history in blood-erasing resistance and replacing it with parody. The sagas of the conquered were silenced. The roars of the crowd became their epitaphs. In the arena, Rome's enemies never won. They never even stood as equals. They were costumes, props, objects of mockery, their humanity stripped away. The Colosseum's stones still carry this legacy. Reliefs of fighters with grotesque helmets and caricatured armor remind us that these were not battles of honor. They were performances of humiliation. Every match was a story, and every story ended the same way: Rome triumphant, the other destroyed. The arena was not only a theater of death, it was a theater of identity, where people became symbols, where culture became costume, where humanity itself was reduced to ridicule. And beneath the applause lay the lesson Rome wanted carved into memory. The empire did not just conquer bodies, it conquered meaning. By midday, once the morning duels had stained the sand crimson and the crowd's appetite began to wander, the games shifted into a new, darker gear. What followed was not combat, not even mock battle, but raw execution disguised as theatre. Rome called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. To the condemned it was not trial, but sentence. To the crowd it was not justice, but entertainment. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, and prisoners of war were cast as unwilling actors in scripts they could not refuse. Every punishment was staged with a cruel creativity matched to the crime in a way that turned law into spectacle. Arsonists were burned alive. Thieves were torn apart by wolves, their hands ripped before the eyes of 50,000. Traitors were hurled to lions, their bodies shredded into warnings. Execution became a morality play, written not in ink, but in blood. The scale of it staggered belief. During Emperor Trajan's victory, celebrations after conquering Dacia, the arena ran executions for 103 straight days. Thousands of captives died in wave after wave, not in chaotic carnage, but in carefully arranged sequences. Morning duels fed into midday executions, which fed into evening finales. Each death was part of a rhythm, a grim choreography designed to keep the audience breathless. The beasts were stars of this macabre stage. Lions deliberately starved were released at the peak of their frenzy, the timing calculated so that their roars carried across the marble tiers before the first strike. Bears chained in pits, until maddened by frustration, were unleashed in sudden fury. Leopards valued for their speed and elegance were saved for the grandest scenes, their victims dressed in colorful tunics so that their thrashing bodies painted the sand in spectacle. The audience's excitement fed on uncertainty. Would the lion pounce, immediately crushing the condemned in a heartbeat? Or would it circle and toy with its prey, batting the body with heavy paws until the crowd howled for the kill? The psychology was as important as the blood. Suspense was the glue that held 50,000 minds captive. Sometimes the executions were clothed in legend. Prisoners were forced to play mythic heroes, doomed to fail. One man became Orpheus, musician of the underworld, seated with a lyre before cages of beasts. In the myth, animals were enchanted by his song. In the arena, a bear was released to maul him mid-performance. Another captive played Prometheus chained as vultures circled overhead before tearing into his flesh. Hercules was reimagined not as a demigod, but as a man in a tunic soaked with pitch set alight until his screams echoed across the tiers. These were not stories anymore. They were blood-drenched parodies. Myths reduced to mockery, heroes to corpses. For Rome, it was propaganda as much as cruelty. Every legend, every cultural touchstone could be rewritten in the sand, reshaped into a spectacle that ended in domination and death. Archaeology preserves hints of this theatre. Animal bones with deliberate cut marks suggest handlers weakened beasts before release, ensuring the performance unfolded on schedule. Inscriptions on arena walls recorded the crimes of the condemned, branding them forever in public memory. In North Africa, mosaics depict scenes of men attacked by lions, labeled not with names, but with offenses: thief, arsonist, traitor. The crime became costume, the punishment became performance. The audience watched with more than casual amusement. They shouted advice to executioners, jeered at condemned men who tried to flee, mocked women who begged for mercy. Writers like Seneca complained that midday executions did not cleanse the soul, as the state claimed, but hardened it. Watching men torn apart did not instill virtue. It normalized cruelty. It made violence communal. Even children sat in the stands eating bread while prisoners burned. Vendors hawked watered wine while wolves ripped throats. Laughter mingled with screams. The boundary between justice and amusement collapsed until they were the same. To die in the arena was not only to lose life, it was to become entertainment stripped of humanity before tens of thousands of eyes. The cruelty stretched beyond fire and beasts. Crucifixion was staged right inside the Colosseum bodies nailed to wooden beams erected on the sand. Rows of condemned hung in the sun, groaning as the crowd strolled past. Sometimes crosses were set aflame, turning the condemned into what Christian writers bitterly called living torches. Tertullian seethed that men and women were transformed into lanterns, their burning flesh illuminating Rome's nights. Yet, the state cloaked these horrors in righteousness. Executions were framed as deterrent, as moral lesson, as tribute to the gods. The audience accepted this justification. But the truth was visible. The law itself had become theatre. Punishment was less about justice than about awe. Fear reinforced loyalty. Spectacle reinforced power. Not everyone submitted. Philosophers decried the games as corruption. Early Christians embraced martyrdom, transforming their deaths into counter-spectacle. When lions tore believers apart, they sang hymns, turning Rome's theatre into testimony of faith. But these voices were drowned by the thunder of the crowd, their dissent swallowed in applause. The Colosseum's midday scenes reveal Rome at its most honest. The empire ruled not only through armies and taxes, but through the staging of cruelty. The condemned became characters, their death scripts to reassure the crowd of Rome's supremacy. Every torn limb, every burning body, every scream swallowed by the roar of beasts served the same purpose, to remind the living that Rome commanded not just law and order, but life and death itself. The Romans believed they owned not only land people and beasts, but also stories. In the Colosseum, myths that had shaped the Mediterranean world for centuries were ripped from scrolls and songs, then mutilated into spectacles of death. What poets had sung as beauty Rome turned into parody. What playwrights had written as tragedy Rome staged as grotesque comedy. Every myth became a script for execution. One of the most infamous was the tale of Orpheus. In legend, his lyre enchanted animals, taming even the wildest creatures with song. In the arena, a condemned man was forced to play Orpheus' lyre in hand, seated in the sand while cages rattled. The audience laughed at the absurdity, the music barely audible above their jeers. When the gates opened, a bear was released. It ignored the tune and mauled the man, blood splashing across his strings. A story once about art's triumph over nature became a bloody reminder that in Rome, music meant nothing against teeth and claws. Prometheus chained for stealing fire from the gods was another myth repurposed. Prisoners were bound to rocks in the center of the arena, their arms spread wide as vultures wheeled above. When handlers released the birds, the spectacle became obscene. Real flesh replaced metaphor, the condemned torn apart under a myth that once warned of hubris, but now served as nothing more than cheap entertainment. Other myths played out in fire. Victims dressed as Hercules were soaked in pitch and set alight, screaming as they staggered across the arena. What had once been a tale of heroic suffering became mockery, the man's cries mingling with the crowd's cheers. The audience did not see a demigod enduring poison, they saw a body consumed, flames licking the edges of his costume until flesh and fabric fused. Some of the cruelest spectacles involved contraptions. The story of Daedalus and Icarus. The craftsman who built wings of wax was restaged, with prisoners strapped to crude wooden frames meant to mimic flight. A condemned man would be hoisted into the air, flapping helplessly as if soaring. Then the mechanism would collapse, plunging him into waiting beasts. The poet Martial mocked one such victim, writing that the man must have wished for real feathers. To the crowd, the terror was comedy. Perhaps the most grotesque was the staging of Pasiphae. The queen cursed to desire a bull. In myth, she was hidden in a wooden cow to consummate her unnatural lust. In the arena, the Romans constructed mechanical beasts, forcing women or condemned men to play the queen, humiliating them before killing them. What had once been a cautionary story about divine punishment became pornography, torture, and execution wrapped into one. These spectacles did more than shock. They rewrote culture itself. By turning myths into executions, Rome proclaimed that even gods, heroes, and legends were not safe from its power. Nothing was sacred. Nothing beyond parody. A prisoner playing Orpheus did not just die, his death mocked art itself. A man burned, as Hercules did not simply perish. His suffering mocked the very idea of heroism. Archaeological evidence confirms these performances. Reliefs carved into amphitheater walls depict men in theatrical costumes, their bodies mauled by animals. Inscriptions describe executions in the manner of Orpheus or as Prometheus. The detail is chilling. These were not occasional flourishes, but recurring entertainments repeated often enough to become standard. Even the Colosseum's architecture was adapted for myth. Trapdoors allowed beasts to emerge suddenly, as if conjured by gods. Stage machinery lowered men from above, mimicking descent from Olympus. Channels beneath the sand allowed fires to flare, and water to flood, transforming the arena into underworld sea or sky. Rome did not merely retell myths, it engineered them into death sentences. The cultural violence was immense. Myths had long been vessels of meaning stories, through which societies explained God's morality and fate. In the arena, these meanings were inverted. Prometheus no longer symbolized defiance. Hercules no longer represented endurance. Orpheus no longer embodied art's power. Their stories ended not in inspiration, but in spectacle. For generations of spectators, myths became associated less with wisdom than with the laughter and applause that followed slaughter. The victims themselves were denied even the dignity of anonymity. To be cast as Orpheus or Hercules was to die not only as a criminal, but as a corrupted symbol. The condemned became props. Their individuality erased, their suffering consumed by the audience as parody. Not everyone accepted this. Early Christians condemned such perversions of myth as blasphemy. To them, it proved that Rome not only persecuted bodies, but desecrated truth. Writers like Tertullian mocked the empire for reducing divine stories to charnel house jokes. But their protests carried little weight against the tide of applause rising from 50,000 voices. These mythic executions reveal perhaps the truest face of the Colosseum. Rome did not simply revel in blood. It sought to control meaning itself. By corrupting myths into punishments, the state demonstrated that no story, no tradition, no sacred text could stand apart from its dominance. The empire claimed authority not only over the living and the dead, but over imagination itself. In the end, the arena became not a theatre of myth, but a tomb for it. Legends once meant to inspire courage and art were drowned in laughter and jeers. Their echoes, like the bones of the condemned, remain in the sand, reminders that Rome's cruelty was not content with killing bodies. It sought to kill meaning too. The Colosseum was not only a theatre of death, it was an engine of engineering, a machine built to transform cruelty into spectacle, with firewater and stone as its gears, where poets carved myths with words and sculptors, with marble Roman engineers carved suffering with mechanisms. Every drop of water, every flare of flame, every hidden passage was designed to turn execution into performance. Long before the Colosseum rose, Rome had flirted with naval battles staged for amusement. Julius Caesar set the precedent in 46 BC, digging a vast basin near the Tiber and filling it with water. Thousands of captives were forced onto ships, commanded to fight as rival fleets until the last corpse sank. The scale was staggering. Real triremes, clashing in a man-made sea arrows, streaking across the sky while chained men screamed below deck. The message was unmistakable. Rome could not only conquer seas abroad, it could manufacture them at home. The emperors who followed escalated this madness. Augustus constructed an artificial lake nearly 2,000 by 1,200 Roman feet, fed by a custom aqueduct, the Aqua Alsiatina, designed solely to supply these blood oceans. 30 warships clashed there, each manned by prisoners destined never to leave alive. The logistics were immense. Thousands of oarsmen, handlers, soldiers, and engineers, all to drown captives for the satisfaction of a crowd. By 52 AD, Claudius staged an even more audacious naumachia on Lake Fucine, draining part of the lake itself to create a vast arena, when thousands of doomed men greeted him with the chilling salute. Avo morituri te salutant. Hail. Those who are about to die salute you. History gained one of its most haunting lines. Whether rehearsed or spontaneous, it captured the hopelessness of men made into props, forced to give dignity to their own execution. The Colosseum absorbed this tradition and made it permanent. Engineers constructed channels and sluices beneath the arena floor, allowing the sand to be flooded and drained with astonishing speed. Within hours, the floor could transform from dry battlefield to shallow lake. Prisoners who survived morning duels might be forced back into the arena by afternoon, now shoved aboard rafts or crewed ships to reenact naval battles where drowning arrows and blades competed in efficiency of death. Fire joined water as Rome's twin tools of cruelty. The most infamous device was the tunica molesta, a shirt soaked in pitch, tied around the condemned, then set ablaze. Victims staggered across the sand, living torches, whose bodies lit the spectacle. Tertullian, an early Christian writer, wrote with bitter fury that men and women were transformed into lanterns, their agony mistaken for light. To the audience, it was Theater Hercules, consumed by flames, martyrs turned into grotesque candles, their cries drowned by cheers. Architecture itself became complicit. Trapdoors hidden in the arena floor allowed sudden appearances of beasts of fire, of men lowered from above like gods descending from Olympus. Stage machinery mimicked mountains, forests, or underworld caverns. On some occasions, prisoners costumed as mythic villains were made to face elements as weapons. Flames erupted from hidden channels. Jets of water surged to mimic seas. Rome's cruelty was choreographed with the precision of engineering. The ingenuity shocked foreign visitors. Writers from Greece and the East marveled at the mechanism's whole forests rising from beneath the floor. Artificial waterfalls cascading from painted scenery cages, springing open in choreographed sequence. To them, it was not only barbarity, but marvel. A glimpse of how Rome's obsession with control extended even to nature itself. If the Empire could summon fire and flood on command, what could possibly resist it? But beneath the marvel lay waste. Each Naumachia consumed resources on a scale that crippled provinces. Timber stripped forests. Thousands of slaves died, not in battle, but in construction of basins and aqueducts. Water diverted for these spectacles left fields dry. Flames consumed pitch and resin imported across seas. The cost of cruelty was measured not just in lives, but in hunger and ruin that spread far from Rome. Archaeology confirms the toll. Charred remains in the Colosseum's substructures reveal repeated use of fire spectacles. Channels beneath the arena bear lime deposits from countless floodings. Inscriptions record massive imports of timber and tar in years coinciding with games. Even now, the stone carries scars, grooves worn by machinery iron fittings, corroded by centuries reminders that beneath the sand lay a factory of death. The ingenuity of cruelty had a purpose beyond amusement. It was propaganda. By bending fire and water into instruments of death, emperors claimed mastery, not only over men, but over nature itself. To drown captives was to prove Rome commanded the seas. To burn them was to prove Rome commanded fire. To summon forest storms or caves from beneath the sand was to prove Rome commanded the earth. Every spectacle proclaimed the same message. The world itself bowed to the empire's will. Not all accepted this message. Seneca, watching midday executions, confessed that the sight hardened rather than purified him. He warned that cruelty rehearsed so often could only corrupt a society, but his words were drowned in applause. His philosophy, buried beneath the roar of crowds, delighted not only by death, but by the ingenuity that delivered it. The Colosseum, in the end, was more than stone. It was a machine of imagination, where cruelty became technology, and engineering became propaganda. Water, fire, and flesh were its raw materials. The audience's awe was its product, and the victims, thousands upon thousands, were its fuel. If the Colosseum was a machine of cruelty, emperors were its operators, and some used it not only to rule, but to indulge madness. The arena became their mirror, reflecting obsessions, insecurities, and paranoia. What should have been governance turned into performance. What should have been law became whim. Caligula, remembered for his unhinged reign, embodied the danger of spectacle unchecked. He adored the arena, but grew restless when beasts ran short. Ancient writers tell us he once ordered spectators themselves dragged from the stands to fill the gap. People who had come to watch became the watched, their screams swallowed by the same cheers they had given minutes earlier. For Caligula, the line between citizen and captive meant nothing. All were actors in his theatre of terror. Nero transformed the arena into his stage, less a ruler than a performer. Obsessed with music and drama, he dressed prisoners as tragic heroes from Greek plays. Their fates were scripted, but with one grotesque twist, their deaths were real. Orpheus torn apart by animals, Hercules consumed by flame actors forced into myth only to be slaughtered for applause. Nero called it art. Rome whispered madness. Yet the audience clapped not from admiration, but from fear. Silence in the stands could be fatal when the emperor demanded ovations. But it was Commodus who pushed the theatre of emperors to its most grotesque extremes. Cloaked in the skin of a lion wielding bow and club, he presented himself as Hercules reborn. Day after day, he strode into the Colosseum, slaughtering animals crippled beforehand to guarantee his victory. Lions chained ostriches, hobbled bears, half-starved, all staged so that Commodus could play God. The spectacle was hollow, but applause was compulsory. Those who failed to cheer risked exile, prison, or death. Commodus's vanity reached absurd heights. He demanded the months of the year be renamed after his titles. He erected statues of himself as Hercules across the empire. In the arena, he killed with ease because the contests were rigged. His opponents carried blunted weapons. He carried the weight of imperial authority behind every blow. The result was predictable. The emperor always triumphed, the emperor always shone, and the empire bled to finance his charade. Economically, the cost was catastrophic. Commodus bankrupted the treasury, diverting funds to finance games that showcased his ego. Hundreds of animals imported, thousands of handlers, employed all for the emperor's personal theatre. Rome's economy strained under the weight of applause he demanded. By the time of his death, the empire's coffers were nearly empty, drained not by war or infrastructure, but by vanity staged in sand. The madness was not confined to those three. Even emperors considered competent could not resist the intoxicating power of spectacle. Trajan, celebrated as a just and capable ruler, marked his victory in Dacia with 103 consecutive days of games. Thousands of deaths. Gladiators, captives, animals folded into a celebration that blurred triumph with massacre. If Rome's best emperors indulged in cruelty on such a scale, what chance was there that its worst would restrain themselves? The psychology behind this indulgence was clear. For emperors, the Colosseum was a laboratory of power. Here they did not merely govern, they commanded life and death with the flick of a thumb. They rewrote myths, humiliated enemies, and even transformed citizens into victims. The crowd's roar was addictive. Applause became proof of loyalty. Silence a threat. Each emperor sought to outdo the last, chasing ever greater displays of domination. But spectacle carried risks. Caligula and Commodus both died, violently remembered not for statecraft, but for theatre written in blood. The arena that elevated them also revealed their madness, exposing emperors as actors in their own undoing. Even their assassins understood the irony. When Commodus was strangled in 192 AD, it was not on a battlefield or in the Senate, but in the privacy of his bath, silencing a man who had demanded cheers until his final breath. The arena made emperors gods in life, but mocked them in memory. Caligula remembered as a butcher of citizens, Nero as a singer in flames, Commodus as Hercules in costume. Their legacies were not marble or law, but ridicule carved into history. The very tool they used to magnify their power ensured they would be remembered for madness. Archaeology still carries their fingerprints. Inscriptions commemorate Commodus's games, listing numbers of slain beasts as if tallies of victory. Coins, minted during his reign, depict him as Hercules' club in hand, lion skin draped across his shoulders. These artifacts are propaganda frozen in metal testimony to how far emperors blurred line between governance and theatre. But they are also evidence of decline. When rulers spend silver on vanity rather than defense, when beasts are hunted to extinction for applause, when citizens fear clapping too softly, the empire corrodes from within. The Colosseum was their stage, but it was also their undoing. In demanding the theatre of cruelty serve their egos, emperors revealed fragility masked as power. Rome could project domination across continents, but inside its heart, rulers chased validation in the screams of dying men and beasts. The empire's strength became its sickness. Not every Roman applauded. Even in a society addicted to spectacle, there were dissenters, philosophers, poets, and the first Christians who saw in the arena not glory but rot. Their voices were quieter than the roar of the crowd, but they carried warnings that echoed long after the games fell silent. Seneca, writing in the 1st century, confessed with unease what the midday executions did to him. He went expecting discipline, expecting to harden his resolve by watching criminals suffer. Instead, he found his soul corroded. "I come home more cruel and inhuman," he wrote, "because I have been among humans." To Seneca, the games were not moral lessons, but infections spreading cruelty into everyday life. His words reveal a truth most Romans refused to admit. Brutality, practiced as entertainment, seeps outward, shaping the hearts of those who watch. Cicero, decades earlier, had walked the same uneasy line. He praised bravery and admired valor, yet condemned cruelty for cruelty's sake. Even he admitted that the mob demanded shows as proof of generosity. To govern meant feeding the beast bread for hunger, blood for excitement. Leaders who refused risked riots. Leaders who complied risked decay. Cicero's ambivalence captures the trap Rome had built for itself. The arena was both dangerous and indispensable. Poets too left their testimony. Juvenal writing in the 2nd century mocked the public hunger with a phrase that survives even now: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. To him, the mob had traded its birthright of citizenship for cheap food and endless spectacle. Where once Romans prided themselves on discipline, they now begged for gladiators and grain. Juvenal's sneer cut deep. A people who live for amusement cannot endure. But it was the Christians who stood most firmly in opposition, and it was in the arena that their opposition was tested. To them, the amphitheatre was both persecution and proof. Those who refused to renounce their faith were thrown to lions, burned alive, or crucified, while the crowd howled. Yet, their deaths meant as humiliation became testimonies of defiance. Writers like Tertullian called the shows seeds of cruelty, indicting an empire that trained its people to cheer injustice as sport. Martyrdom inverted the spectacle. Where the crowd expected terror, they sometimes found serenity. Accounts describe Christians entering the arena singing hymns, embracing death as witness. Their blood spilled for mockery fertilized their faith. Tertullian wrote with pride, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. What Rome intended as erasure became memory. What Rome staged as dominance became resistance." The church's response extended beyond martyrdom. Bishops and preachers condemned attendance itself as sin. To watch was to participate, to clap was to approve, to delight was to be complicit. This moral stance set Christianity apart, drawing sharper lines between the faithful and the empire's values. When Christianity later became Rome's official religion, these condemnations played a role in the decline of the games. But in the centuries before, Christians paid in flesh to hold that line. Even outside philosophy and religion, quieter records of discomfort survive. Pliny the Elder, more naturalist than moralist, noted with sorrow how rare animals vanished from their homelands after decades of slaughter. Lions and elephants were driven toward extinction not for necessity, but for applause. His lament stands as one of the earliest recognitions of ecological collapse caused by spectacle. For Pliny, the games were not only cruel, but wasteful, devouring nature itself. Yet for all these voices, silence remained the rule. The annals recorded victories, emperors, and festivals. They seldom recorded the victims. Women enslaved children, discarded men executed as props, all erased from parchment, preserved only in soil. The dissenters could not drown the crowd's roar. They wrote in margins while tens of thousands screamed approval. But those margins matter. They remind us that not everyone was blind. In a society rehearsing cruelty until it felt normal, there were still eyes that saw, still hearts that recoiled. Philosophy, poetry, and faith left warnings. Rome itself ignored. The power of these quiet voices lies not in their immediate effect. Rome did not stop emperors, did not relent, but in their survival. Seneca's letters, Cicero's orations, Juvenal's satires, Tertullian's indictments, they endured long after the sand was cleaned and the bones were forgotten. They let us hear the conscience of an empire drowning itself in spectacle. In the end, Rome's critics stood in contrast to its crowds. The people roared approval. The emperors strutted in costumes. The philosophers cautioned. The poets sneered. The martyrs died. History listened more to the quiet voices than to the cheers.